I think he was probably one of the greatest artists of all time. And in fact, like all truly great artists, his work grows in one's mind every time you see it and looks different all the time.
He opened the floodgates. He freed up almost everyone in the century to follow on and obey their own sensations, their own passions, their own obsessions.
I think he's probably one of the most powerful artistic personalities of modern art. I would think he was almost more powerful as a presence than Picasso.
Paul Cezanne is the father of modern art. Without his vision, there would be no Cubism, and without Cubism, there would be no Picasso. But still, Cezanne remains a mysterious and misunderstood artist. He is often seen as the inventor of a new type of analytical, passionless art. But nothing could be further from the truth. No one used colour more passionately than Cezanne. From the pinks of his early nudes, to the greens of his mature landscapes, to the blues of his late work. And rather than a cool, cerebral figure, he was a deeply troubled man who struggled all his life to overcome personal demons.
We know very, very little about the biography of his life. I mean, if you think of his contemporary Monet, we practically know what Monet had for breakfast every morning. The hard facts about Cezanne are remarkably limited. He was a loner, he was a real maverick, but he was very clear about being who he was, a man who was very much a provincial from this then very isolated area in the south of France.
Cezanne spent most of his life in obscurity in his native Provence in the south of France. He was born in Aix-en-Provence in 1839. Aix is now a popular tourist town, but in Cezanne's time it was a sleepy backwater, famous for its fountains but for very little else. The town enjoyed its independence, was happy to not move with the times, and even declined a railway to connect it to the modern world. Cezanne found it claustrophobic and restricting. His life there was dominated by his father, a tyrannical and repressive figure who resisted Cezanne's early attempts to be an artist.
Je sais que, bon, il craignait beaucoup son père et n'osait pas le lui dire. Lui parler de son intimité, de sa vie, en dehors de sa vie professionnelle.
Que l'éducation, c'est vrai que Louis-Auguste n'était pas un personnage très facile d'abord, il était très froid, et comme c'est lui qui dirigeait la famille, tout le monde devait, et même Cézanne adulte, comme c'est son père qui l'entretenait, devait obéissance à son père, ça c'est certain.
The oppressive atmosphere of the Cezanne household seems to have stunted Cezanne's emotional life, producing all kinds of frustrations that would eventually emerge in his art. The paintings of the first phase of his career are heavy images of nakedness, rape and murder. He was obsessed with the world of flesh, but at the same time terrified of it.
He was a man full of anxiety, and I think the eroticism is right at the core of that. And there's no doubt at all that for him the human body was a very disturbing thing. He found it very difficult to work from the naked female body because it disturbed him, and I suspect it probably aroused him too much also.
The figure who encouraged Cezanne's artistic obsessions and pushed him to defy his father was his boyhood friend Émile Zola. Zola would become France's most celebrated writer. They supported each other's dreams and ambitions. Their bathing trips were later recalled by Cezanne as the only truly happy moments of his life.
I think probably it was a relationship ultimately that meant most to him. in his entire life. They were schoolboys together, and Cezanne was physically much stronger than Zola, who was rather a fragile child, and Cezanne protected him, and their ramblings in the countryside, I think they remained in Cezanne's mind throughout his life as the most idyllic period of his existence. And I think Zola also, originally at least, saw it in this light as a sort of wonderful idyll in the baked southern countryside.
But Zola left Aix for Paris to try to become a writer. It took Cezanne 3 years to go against his father and follow Zola there. In his letters back to Aix, Zola had portrayed Paris in a way that turned it into a fantasy city for Cezanne, a place of learning, culture and romance.
Sans Paris, comme beaucoup d'artistes à l'époque, il ne serait pas véritablement devenu lui-même. D'abord, il a découvert non seulement des camarades artistes comme ceux dont on a parlé, Renoir, Monet, etc., Pissarro, mais surtout, il a découvert le Louvre. Et tout ça, évidemment, sans Paris, il ne l'aurait pas vu. Il s'est tout de suite confronté avec ce qui se passait, ce qui était bouillonnant depuis 50 ans dans la vie artistique parisienne. Et cela, c'est indispensable. Il serait resté un peintre provincial sans cela.
Paris made Cezanne as an artist, but he was always lonely there. The one place he did feel at home was the Louvre, which he visited every day. He studied the art of the old masters with passionate admiration.
Cezanne certainly emulated great figures from the past. The great Venetians were the ones he most frequently referred to. He admired Delacroix. He even painted an apotheosis of Delacroix. He copied Rubens. He copied sculptors in the Louvre. He was in fact the great copyist in the proper sense of the term, in that he learnt or taught himself through copying in the Louvre. But none of this was in any way to do with theory. It was to do with gaining an experience, with trying to slip, so to speak, into the skin of the spirits who he admired so much.
Cezanne admired the blatant sensuality of the two most popular contemporary French painters, Delacroix and Courbet, whose art was deeply rooted in the past. He copied Delacroix's romantic subjects and the solidity and heaviness of Courbet's figures. Both artists portrayed flesh vividly and voluptuously as the old masters had done.
We have forgotten about Cezanne's links with tradition, and I think it's the early work that really makes us aware of that and how important it was early in his career. In paintings like The Rape, we see this huge classical figure of Pluto, who is bronze and based on his study of classical statuary in the Louvre, carrying off the languid, sort of pallid figure of Proserpina. It's one of many paintings he did in the 60s that deal with the themes of love and death, or sexuality and brutality or violence. And there's an undercurrent of that in many of his more contemporary images as well, like The Murder, where the woman is held down and slaughtered.
Cezanne's obsession with themes of sex and violence in his early art found a parallel in the music of the German composer Richard Wagner. Wagner was a powerful force in French culture. In an age of repression, he stood for excess and abandonment. His opera Tannhäuser was performed in 1861 when Cezanne was in Paris, and it made a deep impression on him. He identified with Wagner's hero.
He depicts himself
in the role of Tannhäuser. But the prominent color throughout the work is a sensual pink that we see in these voluptuous nudes who surround him. And as we know in Wagner's opera, Tannhäuser wakes up confronted by Venus and becomes overwhelmed with despair because he wants to escape. He's glutted with sensuality. And we see in Tannhäuser this struggle between ideal love, or between the spirit and raw sexuality. Cezanne had an enormous capacity to take contemporary themes and use them as vehicles for his own personal torments in a way that few of his peers could.
Cezanne never stayed in Paris for long. He had been encouraged by Zola to think of it as the city of love affairs, but he never had any. He would always return to the family home in Aix. Financially, he was completely dependent on his father. He wrote to Zola describing how he sometimes fantasized about murdering his whole family, but at the same time they provided convenient sitters for his roughly executed portraits. His uncle Dominique sat regularly for him. As well as portraits, Cezanne painted still lives in his heavy palette knife style. He painted this homage to Wagner, showing his mother and sister playing the composer's music at the piano. The empty space on the sofa was once occupied by a portrait of his father, which Cezanne had pointedly painted out. And the family garden provided another subject for these scenes of domestic life. But Cezanne's pictures were considered clumsy and amateurish by the local people who laughed at his style.
Ce que Aix a pu penser de Cezanne, c'était un garnement paradoxal, étrange, qui n'avait pas sa place dans cette ville. Je crois que c'était assez évident. Alors il allait à Paris, en plus il s'est associé à ces peintres étranges qui étaient les peintres impressionnistes. Et quand Cezanne revient à Aix-en-Provence, son professeur de peinture, qui était le conservateur du musée, lui demande « Montrez-moi vos attentats en peinture », comme s'il s'agissait un petit peu d'actions terroristes, violentes, agressives.
Cezanne continued to visit Paris, but remained an outsider there too. Judged by the popular taste of the day, his art was depressing and incoherent, and in bad taste. Like any other artist, he attempted to have his work shown at the Paris Salon, but was always refused. In fact, the authority of the Salon was now under attack from the group of painters who would later become known as the Impressionists. But although they were sympathetic to Cezanne, he felt out of his depth with them. Zola championed the work of the Impressionists, but never gave the same degree of support for the gloomy and violent pictures of his friend Cezanne. Cezanne felt the rejection deeply. When his portrait of the dwarf, Achille Empereur, was turned down by the Salon of 1870, Cezanne was mocked in the press, ridiculed for the ugly crudeness of his art and his peasant dress.
He was a very complicated man in some ways. He had this very simple, direct peasant side to him, which he certainly played up also. I mean, he enjoyed playing the southern peasant, particularly when he was in Paris. He dressed as a southern peasant. He spoke very, very broad dialect. And I suspect it was probably much broader in Paris than when he was at home. And he was extremely intelligent. He had a very powerful mind. He was certainly the best read and the best educated of all the Impressionists. But there was a very childlike streak to his nature.
It's likely Cezanne never had a sexual relationship with a woman until the age of 30, when he began an affair with the 19-year-old model Hortense Fiquet. She lived secretly in his apartment in Paris, and they eventually had a son together. But he rarely spoke of her, and he concealed her existence for many years from his father. It was to be a lasting union, but not a happy one.
Je n'ai aucun souvenir qu'elle ait parlé de Cézanne, pas du tout. Je ne crois que je ne faisais même pas le rapport de cette grand-mère avec Cézanne, si vous voulez.
Moi, je crois qu'Hortense, de toute façon, ne vivait pas, il n'a pas participé beaucoup à l'œuvre de son mari. Elle était quand même en marge. Cézanne était un solitaire et je ne pense pas qu'ils aient des rapports artistiques. D'ailleurs, Madame Cézanne a beaucoup vécu en dehors comment dirais-je, d'Aix, et il n'y avait pas un lien familial, hormis les premières années de leur vie commune.
Cezanne now faced a bleak future as an artist. He was notorious rather than famous, and his ambition to paint as passionately as the old masters seemed doomed to constant frustration. But at the beginning of the 1870s, he was to embark on a journey that would dramatically alter the course of art. His guide was the Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was to be Cezanne's second father. Under his influence, he would begin to look for inspiration not in art or books or music, and not in the demons and fantasies that tormented him, but in the world around him, the world of nature and of light. In the green fields of Pontoise and Auvers, small towns outside Paris, Pissarro introduced Cezanne to painting en plein air, out in the open. Pissarro, a political radical and a Jew, was an outsider like Cezanne, and Cezanne allowed himself to be guided by the older painter, who he later called the good god Pissarro.
Il allait régulièrement à pied trouver Pissarro, et aussi bien lui que Pissarro, ils ont peint tout du long de cette route qui va de Pontoise à Auvers. Il a trouvé à Auvers une campagne calme, très verte, très tendre. La période de ces 18 mois d'Auvers, ça a été une espèce d'éclatement, de libération pour Cézanne. Il a eu une courte mais très belle, très brillante période de joie.
It's only after his contacts with Pissarro and the Impressionists that landscape becomes a really dominant theme for him. Impressionism released him to the extent that I think it taught him something about painting being a joyous activity. And although he never became a true Impressionist, there's no doubt at all that it was his contact with Impressionism that changed him, I think, from being a very turbulent, rather impulsive, perhaps even a fast painter in terms of painting quite fast, into a very, very slow, measured, methodical painter. And I think that had everything to do with the broken, small Impressionist brushstroke.
Under Pissarro's influence, Cezanne began using much lighter colours and painting with short, dabbing brushstrokes in the Impressionist style. The Impressionists used patches of bright, contrasting colours to create images of atmosphere and light. Cezanne too divided his colours, but his emphatic, choppy brushstrokes were used not just to render fleeting impressions, but also to organise the picture, to suggest an underlying structure to the natural world.
The Impressionists accentuated the use of the stroke, the mark, the division of the color as a way of getting closer to an original vision of nature. Cezanne, I think, pushed it further than most of his colleagues did. And it's remarkable. I ask myself, what did he think he was doing? Who did he think would look at these paintings with the stroke divided as obviously as it is, with a green next to a blue, simply juxtaposed. These are not colors that merge in the eye. You get further away, they still look quite distinct. And that's why the work was so shocking to the people around him.
This was one of the paintings Cezanne exhibited at the first Impressionist exhibition held in Paris in 1874. The painting was savagely criticised. The Impressionists were controversial, but Cezanne was considered simply inept. To the show's audience, he seemed as clumsy and crude here as in his early pictures. Cezanne's response was to retreat once again, this time back to his native Provence. He took Hortense and their young son Paul with him, but, fearful that his father's allowance might be cut off, he continued to keep their existence a secret. Rather than going back to the family home, he rented a house on the coast at L'Estaque.
Il a besoin d'un pays rigoureux, avec des géologies fortes, avec des structures, avec un soleil ardent, avec des arbres un peu abrupts, pour une œuvre qui n'est pas du tout impressionniste.
Cezanne wrote to Pissarro saying that the effect of the light in L'Estaque was to flatten the landscape like a playing card. The characteristic flatness of Cezanne's painting, where things far away seem to be pushed right up to the front of the picture, is not hard for a modern viewer to take. But for Cezanne, it was a radical innovation. It made his paintings virtually nonsensical to the public of his time.
The color is so strong. It's intense throughout, and it's that quality of overall intensity that led people to say that the paintings were flat. To a viewer 100 years ago, this made no sense. It would be hard to understand as a landscape because the space did not recede. The L'Estaque picture has the rather simple palette that's characteristic of Cezanne at that time. It's a lot of green, a lot of ochre, or yellowish tones, but the colors didn't seem to coalesce in the way that you would expect them to. They didn't follow the normal patterning of moving coherently from dark to light.
Cezanne maintained contact with Pissarro, but now worked largely on his own. He had found emotional fulfillment in his relationship to nature, but in other ways, he was as awkward and unhappy in his life as he had ever been. In 1885, now 46, he returned to the family home, the Jas de Buffon. Despite the idyllic surroundings, life there was fraught with conflict. Cezanne's father was still contemptuous of him. He had finally revealed the existence of Hortense, but his relationship with her had gone cold. He was irritable and impossible to live with.
He was a very quirky man. He used to fly into sudden rages. He was terrified of being touched unexpectedly. Even his servant, when he was being served his evening meal, if her clothing brushed him when he was sitting at the table, he'd fly into a rage. He used to lose his temper with all his close friends. He ended up by having very few friends. I think there was an aspect of him that was emotionally, perhaps, throughout his life, slightly immature.
His fear of intimacy extended even to his son, Paul. Cezanne's granddaughter recalls an incident that illustrates the torment Cezanne suffered from being with other people.
Mon père nous racontait, quand nous étions jeunes, je vous dis, il ne parlait pas très souvent, mais nous avait raconté qu'en se promenant dans Aix avec son père, à un moment, pour traverser une rue, il avait mis sa main sur le bras de son père, qui lui avait dit, l'avait repoussé, en lui disant « Je n'aime pas qu'on me mette le grappin dessus ».
Against the background of his loveless relationship and strained family life, Cezanne began to paint one of his most serene series of paintings of Mont Sainte-Victoire, the limestone mountain that dominates the Aix countryside. he was to paint the mountain over 60 times, and it would become his most solid and enduring symbol.
Il sait qu'avec le thème de la Sainte Victoire, il va trouver le motif essentiel de sa peinture, et donc il s'adonne à la peinture comme étant son sacerdoce. Il va continuellement revenir vers cette montagne avec une approche, j'allais dire lente. Dans un premier temps, elle est très lointaine, elle est cachée par des arbres, elle n'occupe que le quart du tableau, puis après elle prend une sorte de majesté totale, elle envahit tout l'espace du tableau. C'est une montagne qui va signifier autre chose dans son œuvre. Et je pense que Sainte Victoire comme thème est une sorte de transposition, les psychiatres diraient une sublimation, de son rapport charnel, de son rapport passionnel à la femme qu'il n'arrive pas à maîtriser. Il y a un tableau qui s'appelle Bethsabée. Bethsabée, c'est la femme que le roi David voit, elle est très belle. Et dans le tableau de Cezanne, la femme est traitée comme la Sainte Victoire qui est dans le lointain. Il y a une sorte de transposition, c'est le même profil, le même rapport de la femme à la montagne.
If there is more going on in Cezanne's landscapes than first meets the eye, then his still lifes too seem full of hidden meaning. Cezanne's still lives are well known, but at the same time mysterious. They never quite seem to make sense as a realistic scene. In fact, Cezanne would spend many days setting up the arrangements of objects. The paintings themselves took many months, even years, to complete.
His painting sessions became lengthier and lengthier, and some of those paintings with onions, I'm convinced they began just as onions, but by the time he's finished them, they've all got these long green stalks, foliage coming out of them. And I'm sure those grew during the weeks, the months when he was painting the pictures. The still life have this extraordinary sense of sort of plenitude and fullness. And again, they're substitutes, many of them, for the human body. The apples in particular. There's a very famous essay on Cezanne's apples, and tracing apples back right through the history of art to antiquity as symbols of desire and as substitutes for the loved one.
Cezanne once told Renoir that he painted still lives because women models frightened him. But if he treated his still lives like people, he's often criticised for reducing his human subjects to inanimate objects. There are many stories of his tyranny towards his sitters and his lack of regard for their feelings or their individuality as people. He painted his son Paul many times, sometimes in costume as if he were a mannequin, and Hortense, who he eventually married in 1886 when they were both middle-aged, he painted over 40 times. The sittings were long and torturous.
Elle a quand même beaucoup posé pour lui, il y a énormément de portraits, et c'était assez dur, d'après ce qu'on en dit, de poser pour Cezanne. C'était très long et il ne fallait pas parler, il ne fallait pas bouger.
Et c'est vrai qu'il avait un caractère difficile, mais néanmoins, je crois que c'était un homme plein de bonté. D'ailleurs, on peut le voir dans certains tableaux qu'il a fait d'Hortense. Les portraits sont un peu traités comme, je veux dire, c'est un prétexte et quelquefois ça pourrait être un pichet plutôt qu'un portrait de femme. Il y en a un, voilà, les cheveux dénoués, où il y a déjà, on transparaît quand même d'un certain sentiment. Mais on s'aperçoit aussi qu'il y a une sensibilité qui passe. Donc en fait, Cezanne n'est pas aussi dur qu'on veut bien le dire.
We'll never know what Cezanne's feelings were towards his models, but it is clear that in his portraits, the painting is often more important than the person. To us, these paintings seem full of life, but to the audience of Cezanne's time, they were ungainly and strange. The people are leaning over, their features lopsided, one eye higher than the other, or barely painted in at all. All this was seen simply as willful distortion.
In the Cezanne portrait of Gasquet, Gasquet is posed at an extraordinary angle, the whole position of the body and the head is a very powerful diagonal right across the picture plane. And that in itself is startling. And many of his portraits, the figures take up very powerful diagonals. And if one actually begins to notice how people do appear, you see that this diagonal position is in fact quite common.
Cezanne's tendency to distort the things he painted shows up clearly in his pictures of objects. His still lives are actually composites of slightly different points of view. In this picture, for example, the coffee pot seems to be tipping over, its lid askew. The little olive jar is painted head-on, while the big ginger pot is seen slightly from above. This sense of multiple perspective, which subtly informs all his pictures, was to be seized upon and greatly amplified by painters of the generation after Cezanne.
This is where you get the premonitions of Cubist multiple perspective. It's one of the aspects of Cezanne's work that excited the Cubists so much. I suspect if you'd said to Cezanne, do you realize that you're using multiple perspectives, he'd have said, get lost. I mean, it's not true.
Cezanne had been steadily taking art apart and putting it back together again. He was making a new type of painting that no longer obeyed laws taken for granted for 400 years. But although he was admired by a few painters, he remained unrecognized by a wider public. This was in contrast to his childhood friend Zola, who during this time had risen to become a famous and wealthy writer. Zola bought a grand estate at Médane, just outside Paris, which Cezanne visited and painted. Up till now, he had relied on Zola's encouragement and occasional financial support, but now the relationship was beginning to break down.
Zola était, il faut le reconnaître, un arriviste. C'était un homme qui adorait recevoir. À Médane, il recevait tous les personnages les plus importants des arts, des lettres et de la politique. D'ailleurs, puisqu'il était reçu par Zola à Médane, il était toujours très mal à l'aise dans ses soirées et jouait le paysan en arrivant avec une blouse tachée de peinture et s'essuyait ses doigts sur sa veste.
The final rift with Zola occurred with the publication of his novel Love in 1886. The book was a portrait of the Paris art scene, featuring an unsuccessful artist, Claude Lantier. The details of Lantier's hopeless attempts to cope with women clearly echoed Cezanne's own early experiences.
Quand Zola va écrire l'œuvre, il va tout de suite en envoyer un exemplaire dédicacé à Paul Cézanne, qui lira ce livre, qui le prendra mal et qui écrira un petit mot de félicitation très bref. Et ce sera ce qu'on en a appelé la rupture. Cézanne, éloigné de Zola, dans sa façon de vivre, dans sa façon de penser, a saisi le prétexte de ce livre pour rompre avec Zola.
Cezanne never spoke to Zola again. In the same year the book was published, Cezanne's father died, leaving the family home to Cezanne and a substantial fortune. He was now free to pursue his obsessions and consequently withdrew even more from human contact. By the late 1880s, Cezanne had completely distanced himself from Impressionism. He said, "Impressionism is no longer necessary, it is silly." He fiercely pursued the Impressionist practice of painting outdoors, face to face with nature, but he looked more and more for dramatic and moody locations, like the Bibamus Quarry near Aix, to express his feelings. Art is a parallel harmony to nature, he said. It is not just about looking or copying, but about feeling too. He was searching for depth and permanence in a world he found increasingly hard to live in.
He didn't make the mistake that so many people who have used his name in vain seem to, that by looking at nature a work of art will arrive. Cezanne was a painter. He was not a storyteller. He did not try in any way that we can describe as such to depict nature. He made nature again as a work of art. He realized that painting is not representational, even when it is used for representational ends. Cezanne wished to make and succeeded abundantly in making works of art that were parallel to life, reflected it, but were, of course, infinitely more important.
It's hard to believe now that Cezanne did not have a one-man exhibition until he was 56. This was put on in Paris in 1895 by the art dealer Ambroise Vollard, who had been introduced to Cezanne's work by Renoir. Cezanne sent Vollard 150 canvases, and these were displayed in the exhibition's style of the period, the walls crowded with works. For Cezanne, who had been insulted and rejected most of his life by the Paris art world, the success of the exhibition came too little and too late. He didn't bother to attend the show. But now Cezanne was seen as a new type of artist, one who didn't care about his reputation. This fueled the myth of Cezanne the rebel artist, and after the exhibition, young painters began to make pilgrimages to Aix to meet the now famous recluse.
Young painters would come to him and he would welcome them, even though he was known to be a bitter recluse and turned off the art world of his time. And he told these young painters, I came too early. I should have come along in your time. I'm the primitive of a new art.
People weren't even sure if he was dead or alive. It was like going up the mountain to see the great man. And they started to invent this kind of saint, prophet, enigmatic figure to their own liking. And very early on, this kind of vapor of mystery settled in around him. The man and his mountain, the eccentric of X, it goes on and on and on.
Cezanne had returned to the Catholic Church, but his newfound piety did little to soften his temperament. He continued to insult everyone around him, including the local people of Aix. He felt least antagonistic towards the workers and old people of the town. He said he admired people who had grown old without changing their ways, abandoning themselves to the laws of time. He watched the card players in the cafes, and from his observations of their games came some of his most monumental and touching pictures of ordinary life. He paid peasants to model for these famously atmospheric, powerfully composed scenes.
What's remarkable about Cezanne's card players is the complete passivity of the figures, their solemnness, their introspection, their intense concentration on the cards in their hands as if they were oblivious of each other. There's no sense of dynamic interaction between them. They seem very much absorbed in themselves. There's something almost ritualistic, something very solemn and mysterious about the way he transforms this scene, which could be so easily trivialized, into something very dignified and mysterious. There's a kind of religious or at least spiritual dimension to his vision of card playing.
Cezanne in old age became increasingly reclusive, and he enjoyed more and more just painting anonymous peasants. I think partly because he admired their earthiness and their quality of sort of endurance and resignation that he sensed in them. And he became particularly attached to his old gardener, who was called Vallier. And he used him a lot as a model. And in an odd way, I think Vallier almost became his alter ego in old age. And I suspect they probably didn't talk to each other a great deal, but they seemed to sort of commune somehow. And I think that he saw a certain sort of biblical grandeur in this old man, sort of his gnarled hands and his lined face. And I think that Vallier became this symbol for him almost of, you know, identification of man with the land, with nature.
In 1901, Cezanne had a new studio built at Les Louvres on the outskirts of Aix. By now, both his parents were dead. He worked in isolation, away from Hortense and Paul, who lived in Paris, and without regard for the art of his contemporaries, which he now affected to despise. The road north from Les Louvres leads to the spot from which Cezanne painted some of the most dramatic and striking of his many views of Mont Sainte-Victoire. The last 11 versions were painted over a period of 4 years. They are among his most abstract paintings, with earth, mountain and sky bound together in a single solid structure. Now in his 60s, Cezanne suffered from diabetes. His eyesight was affected and he was oppressed by feelings of failure. Aware that time was running out, he would frequently fly into a rage and destroy his paintings.
The late mountains, to me, are the most moving of all Cezanne's paintings, because ultimately what he most cared about was the countryside around Aix. And the mountain had for him a particular symbolic significance, I think. It's partly, of course, that the contours of the mountain from the studio view, from the Louvre, they become softer. And I think they become, perhaps unconsciously, they become very breast-like. And because of that, there's something very reassuring and sort of welcoming about them. There's a sense very strongly that he's coming home. You know, this is the end.
In his last great series of paintings, which would be based on a theme of water and bathing, of purification, Cezanne would bring together and try to resolve in art all the neurotic elements of his life. In his old age, he still couldn't bear to be touched. He suffered from a paralyzing fear of other people, and in particular, a dread of women and nakedness. All this had been present in a series of pictures of bathers he had worked on intermittently throughout the various phases of his career. There were some 200 paintings on the bathing theme.
Cezanne had a number of fantasies or obsessions throughout his entire life that were probably in place at a relatively young age. He was interested in swimming in water all of his life. He seems to have had some kind of vision of male bathers by a stream in his native town, or female bathers, and it's an obsessive vision that stays with him, and when he is older and in even greater isolation than he had when he was younger and wants to work at a larger scale, he works out that image once again, and what we end up receiving from him are the 3 great pictures of bathers.
During the last 10 years of his life, Cezanne painted 3 large bathers' pictures. Bigger than anything he'd done before, he had a mechanical easel built for them and special slots made in the studio wall to get them in and out. These paintings have the scale and ambition of old master pictures, but none of the serenity and beauty we associate with the old masters. With their odd, misshapen nudes, they remain the most mysterious of Cezanne's paintings.
I've been utterly fascinated by these bathers because of the mystery, because I couldn't figure him out. I couldn't figure out what he was doing. They seem more daring to me than any paintings painted since then. Maybe more daring than any paintings ever painted. What were these deformed, rather homely, even ugly, even horrific figures meant to be? What was he thinking about? What happens to their faces? Who had ever left a painting in that situation, in that predicament before?
I remember as a child being told that it isn't very likely that Cezanne had people prancing around naked on the borders of a river, on the edge of a river, which of course is all too obvious when you think about it. You see this theme of bathers appearing constantly. They're all totally unnaturalistic. Anyone who's seen anyone without their clothes on would know that people simply don't look like this. They are architectural constructions. They are attempts at making great art, pure and simple. They are saying, I too am an artist worthy of a museum.
Cezanne's ambitions for the bathers was that they should match the achievements of the art of the Louvre, the sensuous and voluptuous nudes he admired there. He used his copies of paintings and antique sculptures in the Louvre as the basis for his bathers, often using male figures to make female ones. The bodies are sometimes quite grotesquely distorted, their sexuality often ambivalent. At times he seems to blank out the sexes altogether. In other cases, the people seem part male, part female.
There's a kind of hint of bisexuality that runs through the bather compositions, which has intrigued people for a very, very long time. In this picture, the only hint of bisexuality is perhaps in these two figures. These could easily be men, or more particularly boys, because this brings up one of the most important aspects of the bathers, and that is the extraordinary way that Cezanne looked back on his boyhood and the kinship and friendship that he had with Émile Zola. They would bathe naked in the River Arc and read romantic poetry to each other, and Cezanne remembered it all his life.
Cezanne never forgave Zola for portraying him as a failure in his novel. But when Zola died in an accident in 1902, Cezanne is reported to have locked himself in his studio for several days, weeping.
Some historians have tried to make out that there was a homoerotic element between Cezanne and Zola. There are historians who've pointed out heads that could be either the young, handsome Zola or the young Cezanne himself. So what you get is an incredible 30 years of permutations of sexuality and bisexuality and the separation of genders and love and or hate of women, and it's one of those things nobody's ever going to be able to figure out.
Cezanne never talked about the meaning of his bathers. He was unhappy with them, reworking them constantly. But of all his pictures, these had the most direct and powerful influence on other artists. Picasso and Matisse each bought Bathers' paintings, Matisse nearly bankrupting himself in the process. In 1906, he painted his homage to the bathers with Cezanne's solid structure translated into elegant curves and decorative colour. A year later, Picasso completed his Demoiselle d'Avignon. On the same scale as Cezanne's large bathers, Picasso's picture takes Cezanne's distortions to a wild extreme to create the first Cubist painting. Cezanne, the disciple of the old, had unwittingly become the prophet of the new.
Cezanne was able to suggest to those who were willing to hear that from now on, you could do anything you like in painting. He freed up the possibility of reinventing the figure itself. No one before Cezanne suggested these possibilities in their painting. And so I would propose that Cezanne has left his mark on everyone in this century.
Cezanne worked outdoors, even in the notoriously violent Provençal storms and winds. In October 1906, while out painting the Mont Sainte-Victoire, he was caught in a rainstorm. He contracted pneumonia, and within a few days, unattended by his wife and son, he died.
He continued to agonize right to the end of his life, and he felt that he was never quite reaching where he wanted to reach. And again, in the last year of his life, he said, I think I'm beginning to see the promised land. But he never felt he'd really got there.
Success came late for Cezanne and did little to change his sense of himself as a beleaguered outsider. Reality for him was the Paris salon's constant rejection, the insults and ridicule of the critics. But for the generations that came after him, it was exactly Cezanne's outcast status and the radical innovations he pushed through that made him the father of modern art. He was seen as a deeply moral figure who sacrificed himself for a revolution that would change art forever.
As time goes on and we get to the end of the 20th century, this man who died in 1906, after all, it becomes more and more apparent to each generation, particularly artists, that he is what they feed on the most. It is really quite astonishing, even with people who are 3 generations away from this man, who was very little understood in his own lifetime, to what degree he is the source. He keeps being that reoccurring, remarkably modern artist.
He influenced every single important painter early in the 20th century, but he wouldn't have liked it. And I think he would have been horrified by fully developed Cubism. He'd have thought they were mad. He'd have flown into terrible rage, and I think he would literally have thought, you know, it was a work by insane people.
He has made it possible by his work for all manner of other kinds of art to exist, but there is no reason to suppose that this thought ever crossed his mind. I do not think of him thinking of himself as part of history, other than as a continuation of the work of such great artists as Poussin. But it was because he was so radical an artist that he became their equal.